Okay, thank you everyone for the invitation and welcome to this session. So as we all know, digitalization and the introduction of big tech platforms has completely changed the media field in a lot of ways. So some of this is organic, where there's new products that have been created, you're going to have companies pulling advertising away from traditional media. But some of it is not organic, and some of it is behavioral. And it's because of the sort of dominant behavior of big platforms that are utilizing their strength to determine what audiences see and don't see, what content is used with payment or without payment, and to determine in what format you're actually seeing your news. So this is having a significant impact on the traditional media industry, and regulators have started responding. So with me I have, as has been introduced, some very important regulators from across the continent, and we're going to discuss some of the approaches that are being taken to create digital markets that are fair. So I think we've already been introduced to all our panelists, but just to go through it again, Ninette, who is the Manager of Planning, Policy and Research at the Competition Authority of Kenya. We have James, who is the Chief Economist at the Competition Commission of South Africa. We have Mercy Mutemi, who's the lawyer and a human rights advocate. Human rights in tech architect is the correct designation at Oversight Lab. And we have the chairperson at the Information Regulator of South Africa, Advocate Pansy in Tlakula. So to start off, I'm going to start off with Ninette. So Ninette, there have been great shifts in Kenya's media sector, and you have some of your very long-established media groups that are facing existential challenges. So to start off, what are the concerns that are emerging around big tech's role in media markets in Kenya and beyond? And what are regulators in the Global South doing? Are they showing a greater appetite for enforcement, in your opinion?
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. So yes, that is the truth that there are major shifts in the big tech market that's affecting media. And of course, there are a lot of conducts that have been noted that affect the media space. So yesterday I was watching a DW documentary on TikTok, and we know that TikTok has over 1.6 million viewers. And the interviewer in the documentary was stating that there is not a lot of moderation on the content that comes on TikTok. And so the creators of the content can decide to push anything, and within a click of a button, 1.6 million people will be able to see that. So there isn't a lot of control there. So some of the conduct is about market dominance and market power. These big techs are deciding what the consumer watches, when they watch it, and of course that's affecting a lot of the content created by local media. We note that media houses, local media houses, have lost revenues of about 60%, which really are affecting them and their sustainability. Another thing is that such abuse by the big techs then means that we're not able to verify the credibility of this data, and of course, and then that ends up also affecting the consumer welfare, in that they're deciding what me as a consumer will watch, what I will consume, when I will consume it, and how they're using my information online. With regard to Global South, yes, a lot is being done, but of course there's also a lot of room for improvement. For example, we've conducted market inquiries in Kenya to understand how these platforms work, how they are affecting consumers. We've also worked in collaboration with the Africa Competition Forum. In fact, there was a declaration in 2022. Maybe James can tell us how far that has gone. On how we should collaborate, how we should build capacities of our peer agencies in regulating the digital market. I'm afraid not much has been done. I think there's a lot of areas of improvement, especially with regards to capacity building, knowledge exchange, for us to be able to come up with regulations that will not inhibit innovation, but will create some order and protect the consumer.
Okay, no, thank you. So I think that there are some countries in the world who have tried to intervene in these markets, and South Africa is one that is now doing a slightly deeper dive from a competition perspective. James, you're the chairperson of the Media and Digital Platforms Market Inquiry in South Africa. I know it's still in process and you might be limited in what you can say. But so far through the process, what has emerged as the key impacts and mechanisms used by big tech dominance in the media market, and how's the Competition Commission looking at this in terms of creating a fairer environment for media?
Yeah, I think I can talk a fair amount because we have issued a preliminary report and we're in the process of finalizing it, and hopefully we'll have that out in a few months. But we have benefited from having a market inquiry power, which is different to litigating individual things based on abuse of dominance. And so we can look at the ecosystem as a whole and look at market features that may be impeding competition. So that is a benefit. And the other benefit of an inquiry, I think, is it's a more public process and you get a lot of useful input. And there are many people in this room who've really enriched the process and our insights, which you may not always get in an investigation where you might send out the occasional request for information, but otherwise the team internally tends to be in a silo. So we've looked at search, social media, AI, and ad tech, and I'll try to be brief on each one because each one raises quite different issues, in fact, and require different types of solutions. So search, the search engine proposition is that if you type in a query, it'll come back with the information you need, and that'll keep you going back. And the way search engines ultimately make money is that there are many commercial queries as well. But beneath that, the media queries, and here we're talking about, which we've looked at, is what raises that top stories in Google or the news carousel in Bing, and how often does that happen? So we can't give you the exact numbers because it's confidential, but we can tell you it's anywhere from 5 to 15% of all queries are news related. And that's maybe unsurprising because news is something that people touch with every day and want to hear breaking news, what's going on. And so a huge part of the driver of search engine traffic is in fact news. And so from our perspective, that's the value news brings. The problem in search is that the only way to monetize that is through referral traffic. And the reality is that Google certainly, and most search engines, and in fact most platforms, are trying to keep you on their platform. So they like to package things in a way that ends up what we call with 0 clicks. But the reality is that search referral traffic is nowhere near the kind of value that Google gets out of having news on its platform. And so that's a mismatch issue. The solutions and where we're trying to go is, we're trying to look at, can we find a sustainable commercial relationship that actually means there's a sustainable win-win. So naturally things like Google News Showcase, where there's products which they're willing to pay because they see the value, come into it. But also some foundational funding because the damage has been done. But then about how do we improve referral traffic? And there's a lot of, we'll get into the algorithms, but we're finding there's a bias to foreign media. And why? Because they use proxies to try and determine things like trust. So, of course, if you're CNN with hundreds of millions of users globally, you'll have more links, more clicks, and that'll drive your traffic. So there are problems with these algorithms because of the use of proxies. In social media, I think we're all aware it's the engagement model. Let's drive engagement on the platform. And of course, what that has led to is a whole lot of misinformation, sensational content, outrage at some point to drive the views. But also it has meant that they've sought to cut down on posts where there are links that might drive referral traffic, which is one way the media monetize. It's not the only way, but it's one way. So on Facebook, the data, and this is public, from 2021, posts with links went from 13% of all posts to 3%. So a massive decline. In X, they were clear that they are moving away from people getting off the platform. They want to keep you on the platform. So posts with links too have declined. they've said, well, it's okay, you can monetize on our platforms, but the experience of the media is monetizing on the platform gives you cents, not even sort of decent returns. And the reality is, on something like Meta and X, most of the media are not monetizing. The only thing they might do is have a sponsored post, which they then have to pay to get promoted because they don't have the reach anyway. So I think the solutions there have to be about looking at driving some of the traffic, affecting sort of posts and with links, but also monetization. So the solutions are, to find tools where there can be better monetization on these platforms. And the reality is the shift to video has meant it's not about click-throughs anymore. It's about consuming on the platform. So I think it's a combination there of trying to get the traffic. And then I think the Department of Communications' recent white paper on audio and audiovisual content has a useful observation that in the world of digital, it's about discoverability, findability of public interest media. And by burying media content by Meta, by what they call deprecating the news, they're not making it findable or accessible, which means you don't get that balanced reporting in a sense. AI is interesting, and AI is also interesting from a meta perspective because AI goes back to search. People query and want an answer. Now, because that's a big part of Meta, suddenly Meta's got an interest in now having the news because people are querying the news rather than necessarily looking for it on their feed. But in general, I think what's happened in AI, it's been this huge arms race amongst AI companies, and that may be seen as good, it's competition, but it's meant they've cut corners. And one of the big corners they've cut is they've taken copyrighted material knowingly and used it to train their models. And they've also been using a lot of, obviously, public information, much like search, to ground the answers on news because these models hallucinate. And one of the worst ways they hallucinate is on, in fact, current affair news, where some seriously misleading answers can come out. So they've realized they have to ground. Now, the joy of this is it's led to a market for content licensing. The sad thing is it's the biggest publishers globally and not anywhere in Africa, quite frankly, or anywhere in the global south. So we're seeing Meta do a deal with Reuters and saying, well, that's fine because they're global. We can get Newswire from everywhere in the world, and that'll ground our answers. So like I said, there's an interesting benefit here that it's led to this market. It's how do we deepen that market and how do we ensure that it goes further? Because a lot of the evidence is there's not the clicks. Once you've read the summary, do you really click through? We're collecting more data on that, and some of it is, so close to zero, it's might as well be zero. Some of it's better, and it may mean what is the environment in which the tool is being used. But I think we need to, in a sense, our answers are we have to strengthen the opt-out because the opt-out forces people into content deals. And a lot of the smaller media just simply don't have the technical skills for that. But we've seen over the period of the inquiry, more of the mainstream media actually starting to opt out and exercise those options, which is a really positive thing. And the other is to establish, and this would be beyond competition law, the copyright aspects. I mean, the last thing on AdTech, all I will say is that, we were first, but the US court has now ruled similar to us. And it is a deep monopolization of the whole chain. And the long and the short is the media is probably being shortchanged anywhere from 5 to 10% of revenues in additional fees. Now, the fact that we have a US court ruling means we can actually get some progress in South Africa too. But I think as we've recognized, and what is also public about some of our discussions with Google is you're not going to break up Google in South Africa alone. I mean, it simply is not going to change the market. So you have to look at global solutions here. But it is one where at least there's progress. The EU is hoping to make rulings soon. And so, sometimes it's about piggybacking on what's happening elsewhere and bringing it to our jurisdictions, because it's shocking that something found anti-competitive in their practices in Europe is not even implemented in Africa. And you start to wonder why that should be the case. Surely it should be universal.
And I think that ties into the sort of information side, because the sort of privacy laws and that in Europe aren't, they sort of, in some cases, using different laws in South Africa than they are in Europe. So Advocate Tlakula, in terms of the information regulator, obviously you have the privacy side, and then you also have the PIA side. And for journalists, access to information is pivotal. So, I mean, you've made a sort of, you sort of looking at big tech in terms of PIA requests, and you've sort of come up against some sort of jurisdictional issues. So would you like to tell us a little bit more about the information regulator's experience with big tech, and how you've dealt with these issues?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and to apologize to those who attended the M20 yesterday, because I'm dealing with the same issue. And also to congratulate Gibbs, by the way, because I signed a consent form for taking my picture and video. That does not happen often. So thank you for that. Yes, the information regulator, for those who are not South African, it's a statutory body, independent, reporting to Parliament, and it's responsible for regulating the right of access to information and data protection. One of the few on the continent, I think it's us and Morocco and Botswana recently, who have a dual mandate, and even internationally, I think it's Canada, UK, and Mexico. Yes, we received access to information complaints against 3 social media companies, Google, LLC, and Google South Africa. And the companies, it was media organizations that lodged complaints with us. They had requested this information from these social media platforms, and of course they were denied the information, and then they came to us to lodge a complaint. And it is important, I think, to also make a point that the promotion of access to information law in South Africa, or the freedom of information law as it is known in other parts of the world, it's one of the few that applies to information held by private bodies, including political parties, so that anyone can request any information held by a private body if they want that information to exercise or promote a right. And the law also applies, of course, to public bodies. So that is why the media organizations came to us using our Freedom of Information Act, or PIA as we call it, Promotion of Access to Information, to request information from Google, LLC, and Google South Africa on their content moderation, advertising, competition practices, news content, and so on. And what then happened is that Google South Africa said, look, we don't hold that information. That information is held by Google LLC and Google Ireland. We went to Google Ireland and Google LLC, and they said, look, your law does not apply to us. So you have no jurisdiction to request that information from us. And we had another complaint from Meta, against Meta Inc. and Meta Ireland, and this related to Facebook and Instagram, and the records held by these two. And the media organization that lodged the complaint wanted election-related information related to South African elections, because we had an election last year, and they wanted to know how these platforms were going to address disinformation and content moderation, particularly in the run-up to the election. And we got the same response from Meta saying, look, your law does not apply to us, so we cannot give you that information. TikTok is the only one that said, yes, the law does not apply to us, but they released the information, and they say they're doing that to promote transparency. Now, how do we then move forward? I don't think we can just take it that and fold our arms and say, well, the jurisdiction matter, that's where we are. I think the Competition Commission, I don't know which year, they also had you didn't have a jurisdiction matter which was dealt with by the Constitutional Court to respond to that. But what we have decided to do as the information regulator is to approach the courts for a declaratory order on this issue of jurisdiction, because otherwise we'll have a law that we cannot enforce to social media companies that operate in South Africa. They say that their offices that are here are only for marketing purposes. And therefore, although they are registered with our CIPC, which is the organization that registers companies, they're registered, but they say, no. You see, these companies they're just there for marketing purposes. So we want our courts to help us with this, and if needs be, I think, I know that these people have deep pockets, but I think it's a matter worth pursuing.
Absolutely.
So that's where we are.
Absolutely. So, Mercy, so I think this is something that I think you're probably quite familiar with as a litigator, where you have these companies that have an office in the country that you can't sort of directly litigate against. So from your perspective, in your focus on big tech and their sort of anti-competitive behavior, but also their human rights violations and that, in engaging with courts and regulators, what lessons have emerged from you, and what regulatory gaps or legislative gaps do you see that need to be addressed?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. And there's a sad camaraderie in knowing that jurisdiction challenge is also being experienced here. Just by way of explanation, we have a case, an active case against Meta in Kenya. And this one is on algorithmic amplification of harmful content on social media. And just when you extrapolate that in vulnerable situations, like during elections or in countries that are vulnerable to conflict, just how dangerous that becomes. And of course, the first contest is, we don't operate here. And in our example, they don't even have the cosmetic office in Kenya. So it was purely, you do not have jurisdiction over us. We are not a company that is registered in Kenya. If you want to sue us, you have to go to California. And this is, for me, the biggest lesson for us as litigators and also as advocates looking for interventions in this field is that we also have to do the same. We cannot operate in the traditional rules of tort, or even our traditional understanding of negligence, for example. We have to be creative in the legal interventions we design, which is why human rights litigation has become a very important tool. And I'm glad that the perspective here as well is just the human rights take on what this does mean for journalism and also for the media. Because in human rights law, which a lot of us Africans are familiar with, we get to ask a different question. It's not about the product anymore. It's not about the company anymore. It's about the person. It's about the people and what this is doing to them. So in a recent decision, actually, it's no longer recent because that was back in April, we had the first decision, I think, ever that Facebook can actually be questioned about its algorithm. The historical context here is, for many years in the US, you can't question a tech company for its algorithm because of the immunity offered by Section 230. So to have, on the other side now, in the African continent, courts saying, actually, we can do that. We can ask questions about your algorithm, and not just that, we can examine whether those algorithms violate human rights law. I think that becomes a very important and very potent tool that we need to utilize further, and because this is something we can replicate across the continent. All these issues, all these harms are taking place across the continent. So it's something I've been very keen to crusade about, that this is we have a tool that other parts of the world do not have. The EU have their administrative procedures, but for for our context, we have constitutions that really, really mainstream human rights and give us a framework to hold tech companies accountable. What I've seen in this field and the adjacent field, because I think it's not just about what we're seeing in the media landscape, it's what is also happening in similarly disruptive landscapes, and how not just the courts, but also the regulator has responded. I identified about 5 ways, and I mean, there's lots more ways in which human rights are impacted when there's an interface between journalism and AI. But some of the obvious ones that we've been discussing about actually throughout today have been, number one, journalists are being forced to optimize their content for monetization. Listen, from a business perspective, this makes sense. The market changes, you adapt. From a human rights perspective, there are deeper implications. What are we doing to the right to freedom of expression? What are we doing to the right to freedom of the media? When we say that actually you have to tailor your content in a certain way, because then this has far-reaching implications to the survival of media houses, for example. And what we're seeing is a shift from what is free speech to now this is commercial speech. You're tailoring it for the commercial advantage, and that in itself becomes a human rights implication that we need to now examine. When you take it in the context of democracy, in the context of election information sharing, it's not just about, well, we have to monetize anyway. It's about what narratives are becoming the popular narratives, and these are being forced down by algorithmic decisions that prioritize some content over others. Again, just the fact that the algorithm prioritizes some content over other types of content, that brings a discrimination issue, which in itself is a human rights issue. And this is how we need to also reframe some of these things. It's not just about, well, they run the show, they have dominance. There's another perspective here that I think gets lost a lot, that tech companies have embedded discrimination as a business practice. And they're so confident about it that they rate it into their policies. And we see it as, a usual thing with TikTok and its creator fund excluding some countries and justifying that exclusion. YouTube discriminating audiences based on where the eyeballs are located. And we sort of have come to this understanding that, yeah, well, it's for business decisions, but those business decisions do have discriminatory implications that we constantly need to examine and challenge. I think the zero-click search issue is going to become another very dominant human rights issue, because it's not just about the revenue, it's also about the rights of the authors and the pages you're scraping from, the privacy, the IP implications of it. And one that I think we don't keep in the radar a lot is downstream, there are further implications on the labor force. When you say that a media house is not able to keep up its bills, so it's going to lay off workers, redundancy that is triggered by AI implications is not redundancy as we've understood it before. There has always been in the labor, in labor legal frameworks, there's always been a space for companies to be able to restructure, to be able to prevent redundancies. When disruption is caused by tech, it's violent. It's not in a way that you could step in to protect your workers. We see people shut down overnight. And that in itself becomes a human rights concern, because labor rights are implicated in the process. And you have the competition playing a completely different game. While you're advertising, you have to rely on advertising for revenue, but your advertising relies on a stable labor force that produces quality content. That's the only way you draw in the traffic. Their advertising is reliant on a completely different labor model, which is employing algorithm labelers on a very, very, very freaky labor model where they don't even have to employ them. They can actually just send the work on platforms and not pay their workers. So again, those implications, while they present as very much business decisions, are human rights decisions that need to be examined. And finally, one thing that has been on my mind is how, as a continent, we never quite reached the threshold on universal access. So even the data sets that are available for the training of the algorithms that are then going to be applied to discriminate against our media houses, they already embed a bias. So the regulatory gap there, and it's not just a legislative regulation gap, it's also a gap for our regulators as well, is, first of all, ultimately, as Ninette said, it's about dominance. And dominance is their goal, and dominance is the problem at the same time. Those two things exist at the same time. So for us to be able to make any headway whatsoever, we have to be creative about how to figure out how to split this dominance. Again, realistically, we always talked about the fear of a fragmented internet. I'm afraid we already reached there. I mean, stronger regulators, EU is able to make recommendations and to make decisions that apply to the EU, and tech companies just ignore those for the rest of the world. I always just give the example of the social media you have here in South Africa, in Kenya, is a very different social media that you have access to when you're in the US, when you're in Canada, when you're in the UK, and that in itself is very problematic. But we have to figure out a way to force compliance even on the continent and to be creative about it. Learning lessons, for example, from the ride-hailing industry, where, again, this disruption has been seen, and beyond the disruption, now we see proper exploitation just by the algorithm. And for most of the regulators, the approach has been approaching complaints, especially competition complaints, traditionally about, okay, declare this company dominant. And then that becomes a race that we can't quite win, which is why what James was saying about just doing a market inquiry and understanding the market becomes really, really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think just jumping back to James, so in this inquiry, you've had engagements with the big tech companies, but as you mentioned, there's a power imbalance where the South African Competition Commission isn't going to be able to split Google up realistically from a power perspective. And I think other countries in Africa have a similar problem. There's also sort of the threats that might come through, the threats to, if we have to pay for content, we'll just take news off the platform, things like that. So from your perspective, given the bargaining power of big tech, what are the kind of approaches that work with negotiating a sort of fairer, more diverse media industry, particularly when you're looking at countries in Africa, in the global south, and you're not sort of talking about the New York Times and the Washington Post. So what insights do you have for other regulators in the global south and from your experiences?
Well, I think the first thing is Advocate Tlakula sort of said jurisdiction. I mean, if you can't establish jurisdiction, you're a non-starter. And so fortunate the Competition Act has jurisdiction over economic activity that has an effect in the republics, and so that has been established, and it's been established also through cases unrelated, but in banking and foreign exchange manipulation. So that is almost a basic that you need, because without that they can always walk away. And I think it is important when looking at new laws, and there have been discussions, and we put out a working paper on new regulations around content moderation, but establishing jurisdiction is probably the first thing. I think the second thing is powers of evidence gathering, because ultimately it's evidence and the building of a credible case that brings parties to a negotiation table and to look for some sort of solution. So having the powers to actually get the information, and that does include jurisdiction issues, because we've also faced our own challenges where in running cases, not in digital, but in others where we're told the evidence is overseas. But I think now there's enough jurisdiction established around, enough jurisdiction established through law that we can get a lot of that information. And being clever about what information you're gathering is really important, because the one joy of tech is they have data. And so they will have the data that gives you the answer. It's just framing it in the right way. And whilst things like surveys are interesting, and we've done them in this current inquiry to get the mind of the consumer, but if we want to know how much traffic is moving, how many people click on the first thing, well, then the companies are there. So I think those are the more fundamental. I think the other aspect which an inquiry benefits one as opposed to an investigation is public hearings. And quite frankly, public outrage, because no one wants a bad reputation. No one wants to be hauled through a very public process and told all the bad things that they're doing and the implications thereof. But we also need the media reporting on some of that, to get it out there. And I think, that's an integral part. This one is a media inquiry, so we obviously had some interest from the media, but still the reporting was not brilliant, I must be frank, about, driving those interests. But if you get it into a public debate, if Meta is shamed about, keeping information on people doing child pornography, well, then they're more likely to actually open up. So I think all of those are really important. But ultimately, it is evidence-based. It is about establishing credible case that you're willing to take on appeal. And that's where any lawyer in the room, and we've had many and still some more, will tell you you're weighing up the risks, and that's what drives a sort of negotiation. So we do try to find parties and we've done in this case, particularly tried to bring maybe sky-high expectations from the media down, but also then the cheap offers from the platforms up, to find a space where we can find this sort of win-win solution. And that does take time as well. But a willingness to, in fact, engage, look, open-mindedness about solutions. Because what what we've discovered about tech platforms is there are certain no-go areas where, quite frankly, you can understand the cost of doing, say, technical changes for a single country may not warrant that. But that doesn't mean the end of the conversation. It's about finding the other areas where we can meet each other and see each other. And the solution may not be what you start with, but hopefully you end up with something that moves the media forward.
I just want to, I think... Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I think what you're saying is quite important. Sometimes what we do, because we are so small and we are situated, we are a tiny country in the most southern tip of the world. And sometimes we get scared to take on these big players. But once you take a leap of faith and do that, you find that they respond positively. When WhatsApp introduced its privacy policy, and I think it was in 2021, and we looked at that revised privacy policy in South Africa against what they had introduced in Europe, and it was not the same. And yet our law here, our data privacy law, is based on the GDPR. So there was no justification for this differentiation. So we then did an assessment, because in our law we can do an investigation, we can also do an own initiative assessment to look at compliance, which we did. And we identified areas of non-compliance. And we issued what we called an enforcement notice, which then says to them, comply with the following. And they came back and said, look, we don't agree with you. We are going to challenge your enforcement notice in court, because our decisions are binding unless you challenge the court. And they instituted that review application. It's appeal and review at the same time. I said, fine, we'll meet in court. We are talking now, and I'm coming back to you. Because of that, the issue of let's talk, let's see what is it that we can do so that we can come to an agreement. The discussions are at a sensitive stage, so let me just say that. But it's good because we came together. Because sometimes, like I say, it's just being scared, you know,
Yeah.
because says, let's leave them to their own device. And I think the lesson is that we shouldn't. And we are stronger together on the African continent.
Yeah.
And I think we need to stand up and to collaborate and exchange strategies on how we're going to move forward. Because one of the issues that they like raising, is to say, oh, you see, it's easier to comply in Europe because there's the GDPR. In Africa, of course, you have this convention by the AU, which is, it's a convention, it's non-binding, it's a political instrument. But for me, that's not the point. The point is that we have our laws here, and they have to comply with our laws. And I think that's what we need to be we have to be assertive. I think that's the message that I want to give to all of us as regulators.
Sha'ista, just to chime in also, I think the issue of collaboration is very important. Pansy has said that we are stronger together. So it would be more impactful if the African nations, maybe under AFCFTA, would work together and come up with, a case against these big techs. The other thing is the AFCFTA has the digital trade protocol. We should ensure that it's implemented to protect not only the traders, but also the media and the content that is generated and consumed.
And maybe just last thing to add is the joy of dealing with a global company, their policies are global. So if you find it in one country, the odds are it's going to be the same in the next.
Absolutely.
So, one can, certainly from some of our discussions, it's all right, we'll implement what we're doing in Europe because it's a shortcut to solving the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the panel, I think I think, Mercy, do you want to sort of round off on the kind of continental approach and going forward?
Two things that are coming up very clearly from this panel. I think we are not instigating regulator action enough. I think this is what's coming out very clearly from South Africa, and I think that's a big lesson for us as who we need to initiate action with our regulator, for example, in Kenya, but also to do it in a coordinated way. I think one obvious problem for the media is going to be, what are we going to do about Google AI overview, for example? The top search was already a problem, and now that problem has become even more complicated because really you don't need to click to the website at all. At a time when revenue was already declining, at a time when, as James said, monetizing on the social media platforms themselves is not really a viable option. Then now you take away the advertising revenue from people clicking the links to actually go to the website. But if you examine that example, it's not enough for one journalist or one editor or publisher in Kenya to say, I'm going to take action against Google. I mean, by the time you're done with the administrative stage and go to litigation, it's 7 years, and the technology has really shifted. It's now not even Google AI overview anymore, right? So there's a place here for very strategic and coordinated action on our end, to where people who are experiencing similar patterns of abuse need to do similar things. I hear the point that we're all in competition at the end of the day. Yes, there's space for that, but a friend of my friend is my friend, and your enemy has to be my enemy at this point for this particular purpose, for coordinated action. It's across East Africa, it's across South Africa, but also West Africa as well, and North Africa, where we take coordinated action to fight these things, because by the time you wait for a proper legislative structure, the technology has really moved. Yeah. But for that to happen, two things need to sort of exist at the same time. Our regulators' capacity needs to really, really constantly be improved, but also our capacity as litigators, as advocates, as rights holders needs to improve. You know where it hurts. The media house knows where it hurts in terms of declining revenues, declining viewership, but then that's not what you present to, for example, the regulator. You need evidence. So what the expertise in research, in tracking, it's just something as simple as how many visits did we have last week compared to this week, and compare that to what new release did Google make on the algorithm between that time period. Do we have the capacity to collect evidence at this level to where we can present tangible evidence and say we need action on this? And very quickly, it cannot be that we wait for 2 years and then say we close down because of this, now we need some reparations. It's not about reparations, it's about moving as quickly as the tech is moving. The other thing, the other lesson we've learned from our litigation efforts in Kenya is ultimately, if they are forced to comply, they will do what petulant children will do and say, okay, fine, we quit, we've shut down operations in this country and we will leave. We experienced this with content moderation when Meta was forced to actually obey the law, not to pay people extra, not to give them any fancy benefits, just to obey the law on redundancies. They said, actually, we're not that interested in Kenya anymore, and moved to Ghana, where the same pattern is being perpetrated. So what that tells us is that we don't have the laxity to say, actually, this country is leading in regulatory efforts or in litigation in this. It has to be that we approach this together, so that the collective pressure makes Meta think, yeah, it's way cheaper to comply than to defend 20 different actions on one continent. That's where we need to get to.
And I think the continent is big. There are a lot of consumers. There's a lot of data that they're pulling. So, that's a value that can't be ignored. I want to move on to a round of questions. So I'm opening up the room. Okay, so let's say 1, 2, and 3. Let's do 3 at a time, and then we can see.
Thank you very much. My name is Deodatus Balile. I'm coming from Tanzania. I've listened to the conversation, and looking at the narrative, it's a kind of we are all pushing or pressing so hard towards kneeling the tech companies. Something like which is pushing the mountain or a big stone, which I'm not sure we are going to succeed. But as it stands, Ninette and Messi, they spoke something about content. May I be right if I say nowadays is content everywhere, but no news to consume? And we are duty-bound to build our nations. Whilst we are fighting with these tech companies, what are we doing about the subjects of the states who are pushing these contents, the perpetrators? We might keep fighting the tech companies, but abandoning the duty to raise up our citizens with good manners who are cultured. What are we doing about it to make sure that whilst we are fighting the tech companies, but we are raising up our society in an expected manner?
Let's take the 3 questions, and then we'll give the panel an opportunity to respond.
All right, thank you. My name is Dr. Chifo Momera. I'm a regulator at Acacia. In South Africa, the the telecommunications regulator, rather, let me just simplify it, in South Africa. So I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in South Africa is that we fear a lot of not being consumers of the tech that comes out from the rest of the continent, the rest of the world, rather. If I can start that by saying that if you look at Saudi Arabia, you cannot easily make voice calls on WhatsApp. They go on and block those things. But us, the moment we think that there could be certain things that we can stop if people are not compliant to our laws, we start thinking that the citizens are going to be on an uproar. What do I mean by this? I mean, I'm talking when advocate, you mentioned that When we try to go get the data from the companies, and then they say, no, you don't have jurisdiction. I think the guys in Kenya also mentioned the same thing. Maybe it could be time that we might need to, as you alluded to, look at our laws and costs and say, well, if you don't comply with us, if you're not going to use our data centers, because we are investing a lot on the infrastructure, if you're not going to use our data centers to store your data, then we block your URL from, then the people will not be able to access. It's extreme, but it's one of those things that, again, we must think and say, but because if you think about it, is we got into a point of thinking that tech companies are not, do not have assets. We start thinking of tech companies as if they operate from somewhere up there, from the cloud, and then just come here. Whereas if these companies had physical operation, if it was the companies that were moving physical service, you were going to go on and confiscate their assets. But when we think of the digital ones, we forget that all these big techs at the end of the day ultimately rely on assets which are also physical. So we might need to start thinking about that. What I'm saying right now might be extreme, but I'm sure when we sit down and unpack it, we can see that we can find a way towards that. If, for example, if they don't comply, we throttle them. That's also part of the things that you can do. No, I mean, it's the realities.
Yeah.
It's the realities. It's the way, because as you mentioned, as Africa, we are the biggest customers. In fact, the whole global south, all these developed countries, they've got departments that are just focused on how to extract value from Africa. So if we do that, yes, indeed, you might be thinking that we're not going to have anything, but that, again, at the same time, we might be creating an opportunity for the young people to start the companies that will fill those gaps. And those are just some of the thoughts that I have in my mind. It's a bit extreme, but we could get somewhere.
All right. Can we just take the last question and then the panel can respond?
Thank you. Alison Gilward, Research ICT Africa, University of Cape Town. I guess I was trying to sort of grapple with some of the kind of challenges that have been mentioned here around the sort of complexity of the issues that we're dealing with, the increasing complexity, the fast-moving, the dynamic nature of it, and the agility we need, and the challenges around institutional capacity, institutional design, and indeed sort of more fundamental issues of institutional arrangements. These issues of jurisdiction and co-jurisdiction, which we've really largely been dealing with kind of at national level. But also, this is no longer, these aren't kind of sectoral issues which the Competition Commission is able to deal with because of that, information regulators, but I think the kind of issues that were just raised here, where we're still kind of dealing with these issues, not only from a regulatory siloed point of view, but also from a broader economic point of view. So just thinking, I mean, everybody said, no-brainer that if we collaborate, we can do this better. It's a much bigger market. They won't listen to us on our own as a small market, but as a big market, we could do a lot more. But we saw the inability of the very committed competition regulators to come together on agreed strategy on digital markets and digital market reviews. And again, just to say, in many areas of this of regulation, we've had the capacity, the authority to do market reviews. We've had the legal authority to do the market reviews, but in lack of capacity to actually see them through. So I mean, it's great that the Competition Commission has done it, but this has been quite rare, an ability, especially to lead these kind of things on globally, not even on a continent. So I suppose I'm really thinking about what can we do more formally to get the kind of integration that one sees in Europe and can kind of pull rank with these big operators, because even at the continental level, even where we've tried to get, we were getting harmonization around data, the data policy framework, or we're getting harmonization on interoperability ID or whatever it is, we have the data protocols were mentioned for the African Continental Free Trade Area, and the digital protocols are completely in contradiction to all the efforts, the human rights and the enabling environment and the preferential access to data for Africans, because it's basically a direct copy and paste. Reference use of paper. Sorry, I'll very quickly wrap it up. But just to say that it's a complete copy of the of the World Trade Organization. Exactly, digital copy of that. So, so all I'm saying is that, it's not only jurisdictional issues around a regulation, but also, ensuring that our trade protocols, our trade agreements, promoting the African Continental Trade Area is actually working in line with our data policy on cross-border data flows, that it's actually working in line with our, competition regulation, and whether, to what degree we can formalize that at a national level, both in terms of institutional things, but also in terms of the capacity, in terms of the research required, in terms of the fact that these regulators here probably now need, a bank of data scientists to actually undertake the work that they're going to be doing in future.
Absolutely.
Sorry, long
No.
thing.
Okay, I think just given the time constraints, I'm going to suggest that each panelist give a very quick response and wrap up in one. So I'll start with Ninette, and we can just go through all, and then we'll close on that.
Okay, thank you very much. On the issue of my brother from Tanzania, on how we deal with perpetrators, I think the issue of moderation, the platforms or the big tech should have a clear regulation on how and on what content actually comes for viewership. I think that's where there's a gap. My colleague here spoke about, I think it's Facebook that said so there's need for that and to be enforced, whether it's by the communications authorities or the competition authorities. There's need for moderation so that even my consumer rights are not violated by watching content that's not satisfactory to me. Yes, and I agree with her when she talks about the depth into which we're going in the analysis. Some agencies have set up forensic labs to ensure that the data, the evidence collected is well analyzed so that it gives proper recommendations. So I think that's one of the way of doing it as we build capacity for analysis and investigations in the big tech. Thank you.
Well, I would just say I'm glad we have an ambitious Acacia now, so that's positive. And I look forward to working with Acacia's new councillors. But I would just pick up on one thing that Alison said. I'm not in the camp that says we lack capacity, and we've shown that, quite frankly. And we finished one digital inquiry with a team of about 15 and got as much done in 2 years, which, the UK took 4 years with a team of 100. And it is about being clever with the resources. And some of it's not rocket science. We can make it complex. But to find the preference for foreign media, just look at their share of impressions and their share of clicks. Well, they have a much lower share of clicks and impressions, which means people actually want to read the South African news. We don't need data scientists for that. We just needed a simple spreadsheet. So, I find that, in fact, at the Commission, you've got young people who are tech savvy who can take these on. There are coordination issues and we need to resolve some of those, but I think it's also you need to prioritize. And what I've seen in our discussions in the ACF, and Ninette mentioned it earlier, we came out saying, well, there's a few countries ready to take on the tech giants, and it's going to be the more developed ones who have the resources and where their economy has shifted to online, where there's universal access. But to be honest, a lot of countries, it's not their top priority, and it's about what are your priorities and what are you going to put your effort in. And there are so many things. Even at our commission, food is a bigger priority often than digital. And so I think it is more about where you want to put your resources and what is the most burning issue that we need to think about. But I certainly think we have the capacity to take on, and we've shown it, take on and win. And we shouldn't be scared, as the advocate said.
The suggestion for internet shutdowns as a way to arm twist tech companies. Look, this is what we know. Tech companies care about the numbers, and this is an approach that a lot of Asian countries and sometimes Latin American countries have used, is to threaten, we're going to shut down if you don't take down this page. And it has been effective. Tech companies have acted, but, very strong but, internet shutdowns have very far-reaching consequences. And my question back to you would be, why would we go for the worst-case scenario that has such huge ramifications for human rights when we haven't even started with the most easily available option, which is take action? We are not at the table yet. We hear so much from South African counterparts on how much action is taking place there, but what is happening in the rest of Africa? Like, where are the actions? We are not at the table. We have not tried enough, to have failed to have said, okay, now we have to reach out to the worst case scenario. My parting shot is this: jurisdictional objections are just that, objections. It's just a company trying to run away from responsibility. That doesn't mean that that is the law. The facts speak different. The jurisdictional anchor for anything, commercial activity, human rights abuse, is there activity that is happening in that country? From a commercial perspective, are there commercial interests that are being affected in this country by activities by X? Whether it's a company that's registered here or not is irrelevant, and that in itself becomes a very huge jurisdictional anchor. So we have to take the action, we have to confront the jurisdictional objections, and what we have found out from a litigation perspective, and again we've had from the regulator's perspective, is when you take that step, when you actually do that, they're going to respond, because it's also not in their interest to be reckless about litigation. They have shareholders that they have to respond to. So I guess I'm encouraging us to be more litigious.
Well, I'm going to end with not one of the questions, but with, I've always been a right-to-know activist. Big techs hold a lot of data, and they don't want to make it available. Our ATI laws are no longer fit for purpose because they only talk about information held by public bodies or by private bodies if you can prove that the information is the public interest. To jump that hurdle of proving public interest, we know it's difficult. Let's look at our ATI laws globally, make them fit for purpose, because data that we all need for research, for development, for job creation, doesn't lie with the government. It lies with big techs. So let's look at our laws and modernize them. And that's my parting shot. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists.